Welcome to another thrilling installment on personal finance. This time we're going to try and understand the federal budget. So some of the basics. Receipts or income represent money that has been collected. Outlays or expenses represents money that has been spent. The net income is quite simply just receipts minus outlays. It's just fancy names for money coming in and money going out. So if your net income is positive, the budget has a surplus, and if the net income is negative, the budget has a deficit. Our national, budget has been running in a deficit for a very long time, which is why the national debt just keeps going up every year. So suppose your gross income last year was 40,000. Your expenditures were as follows: 20 grand for rent and food, 2,000 for interest on your credit cards and student loans, 6,000 for car expenses, 9,000 for entertainment, miscellaneous expenses. You also paid 8,000 in taxes. Did you have a deficit or a surplus? Well, basically just add up all of your outlays, right? All of your expenses comes up to 45,000. Therefore, there was a $5,000 deficit. You were basically overspent by 5,000 for the year. So a deficit represents money that is borrowed or taken from savings during a certain single year. It just means that's how much money you went over, your money coming in. So the debt is the total amount of money owed to lenders, which may result from accumulated deficits over many years, right? So for instance, the national debt is in the trillions of dollars because it just keeps adding up. The federal debt at the end of 2017 was approximately 20 trillion. If this debt were divided evenly among the roughly 325 million citizens of the United States, how much would we each owe? Well, those are some big numbers, so we got to use some scientific notation, which ends up giving us an answer of 6.2 times 10 to the fourth, which when you put the numbers into perspective is $62,000 per person. I know I don't want to pay my share. So economists also commonly consider the deficit and debt numbers as percentages of gross domestic product, the GDP. For 2016, the GDP was 18.6 trillion. The total deficit was 587 billion, or 0.587 trillion, right? Because it takes 1,000 billion to get a trillion. And at the end of the end of the year, debt was 19.5 trillion. Find the deficit and debt as percentages of the GDP. So our deficit as a percent of the GDP is just total deficit divided by GDP and then multiplied by 100% to make it a percent. So there's our 0.587 trillion. See, we just have to put them both into trillions. That's why we had to list it as 0.587. So the trillions basically cancel out and we just get a number that is just money, right? So it was 3.2%. So basically that means that our deficit, right, was 3.2% of our gross domestic product. Now, if you take total debt and figure that out, then it's 105%. So that means we're basically in the hole more than we're making, right? Gross domestic product you can think of as all the money that's coming in, and our total debt is so big that we're spending more each year than we're bringing in. Mandatory outlays are expenses that are paid automatically unless Congress acts to change them. Most of the mandatory outlays are Social Security, Medicare. They're called entitlements because the law specifically states the conditions under which someone is entitled to them. Interest on the debt is a mandatory outlay because it has to be paid, right, to prevent the government from being in default on its loans. Discretionary outlays are the ones that Congress must vote on each year. And they're subdivided into those that affect national defense and security and basically all the rest, non-defense stuff like education, transportation, and so on and so forth. So even though these things are called discretionary outlays, some of them have really become mandatory, it seems, in the past, right? We've got, for instance, these Social Security, Medicaid, and other social, that's considered mandatory. But defense also has become pretty much a mandatory thing. I mean, it's been a large portion of the budget for a very, very long time, and Congress really doesn't change those numbers. The non-defense discretionary, that's really the only stuff that seems to waver from year to year or from party to party, whoever's in control. And then this pie chart just shows you what percentage of your income tax goes towards these certain things, right? So 33% of your taxes goes towards those entitlement things, right? And so on and so forth. For 2016, interest on the debt totaled 330 billion, and the total debt at the time was about 19.5 trillion. What was the annual interest rate paid by the government? Suppose instead that interest rates paid by the government had been at their historical average of about 3%. How would that have affected the interest payment in 2016? Comment on the meaning of your results. All right. Well, let's see what we got. To make the calculations easier, let's note that 19.5 trillion is the same as 19,500 billion, right? Because 1 trillion equals 1,000 billion. So you basically just take that and multiply by 1,000. Therefore, paying 330 billion interest on a debt of 19.5 trillion really means 330 billion over 19,500 billion, and you can basically get rid of the billions, and it's like paying $330 for $19,500, which works out to 1.7%, which is really super low. For a loan, most people pay a lot more than 1.7% for money they've borrowed. And so if we had to pay 3% instead, it would have been basically doubled, right? Because 1.7 is a little bit more than half of 3. So it would be 585 billion, much, much bigger, right? So it would have cost us 255 billion more if they had paid a more reasonable 3%. Let's see. You can see that's more than double what the government spent, right? The interest 330, 18 times what is spent on NASA, right? So there's a lot of money going out there for a lot of things, and you can look into it, but all it's going to do is just make you pissed if it's things you don't like, because there's really not much we can do about it. The publicly held debt, or net debt, represents the money the government must repay to individuals and institutions that bought treasury issues. So when the government needs money, they can get it a couple different ways. They can get it from the public by selling these treasury bond kind of things, and then they have to pay those back. Or they can borrow money from other governments, right? Like right now, we owe a lot of money to China. So it just depends on how they're getting their money. And then the gross debt includes both the publicly held debt and money the government owes to its own trust funds, such as the Social Security Trust Fund. So they can also borrow against things. It's kind of like, the old adage of robbing Peter to pay Paul, so to speak. The unified budget represents all federal reserves and spending. Off budget, the portion of the unified budget that is involved in Social Security. The on budget is the rest of the unified budget, everything that is not involved in Social Security. So Social Security is always that extra thing that's stuck on the side. So therefore, the following relationship holds. The unified net income minus the off budget net income equals the on budget net income. Again, who cares, right? We don't really care about most of these things. It's just how does it affect us, right? Well, the federal government had a unified net income of 587 billion, a deficit in 2016. However, the government also collected 34 billion more in Social Security revenue than it paid out in Social Security benefits. That's good. They took in more than they paid out. What do we call this excess 34 billion of Social Security revenue, and what happened to it? What was the government's on-budget deficit for 2016? So that 34 billion excess represents the off-budget net income, a surplus for 2016, because it is counted separately from the rest of the budget. By law, this 34 billion had to be added to the Social Security Trust Fund. Unfortunately, it had already been spent on programs other than Social Security, so the government instead added $34 million worth of IOUs to the trust fund. So this is what I mean by robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? They spend that money somewhere else, even though it's supposed to go to Part A. And so that's how many institutions in the government, Social Security included, are running at deficits, because the money is just kind of floating around and it's going over here and it's going over there. Okay, because the $334 million worth of IOUs will have to be paid eventually, it is included in the calculations of the on-budget deficit, so that's why the deficit is now at 621 billion. Whew, a lot of money, right? Last example, before our heads all explode. In 2016, individual income taxes made up about 49% of total government receipts, i.e., 49% of the total money the government took in. And that was 3.3 trillion. Suppose that the government needed to raise an additional 600 billion through individual income taxes, how much would taxes have to increase? Well, the individual income taxes accounted for 49% of 3.3 trillion, or about 1.6 trillion. Raising an additional 600 billion, or 0.6 trillion, would bring this total to 1.6 plus 0.6, or 2.2 trillion. In percentage terms, we just take the new value, we subtract the original value from it, and then we divide by the original value, and that gives us a percent increase. So this would represent a 38% increase. In other words, on average, everyone's income taxes would have to increase by more than 40%. Now that sounds like a lot. You're thinking, well, if I'm already paying 30%, now I'm paying 70%. No, it's a 40% increase on that 30%, right? So if you were in the 30% tax bracket, you would pay 40% more of that, or 12% more, which is still a whole hell of a lot more, but it doesn't take you up to 70%, right? We can't take percentages. We don't add percentages that way. All right, that's everything we need to know about the federal budget.